long time ago, there was an Irish writer who had a lot to say about Ireland, the church, and his Dublin neighbors. And the only way to say it was to get out of Dodge. That was James Joyce, of course, and he wasn't the first or the last writer who, whether through personal choice or political exile, found his voice by being as far away from his home as possible. Call it the literature of exile, and it was the destiny of Dante, Henry James, Roberto Bolaño, and many others, including my guest today, the Colombian novelist Santiago Gamboa. Santiago left Colombia during its darkest days in the 1980s, when he was just 19 years old. He went on to live and publish books while in Spain, France, and Italy, finally returning to Colombia after 30 years. He is the author of 11 novels, plus a collection of short stories and a travel memoir. Some of his key novels translated into English include Night Prayers, Return to the Dark Valley, and Colombian Psycho. Santiago's novels feature hypnotic monologues, characters yearning to escape and transcend limits and dysfunction, and sometimes violence. You can encounter elements of an old-fashioned detective novel in his works, as well as a sense that this curious business of living will always involve risk, and no one is exempt from its consequences. Santiago has also been a journalist and a diplomat. He has worked as a correspondent in France for the Colombian newspaper El Tiempo, as well as for French National Radio, RFE. And his time as a journalist also included a stint as a combat correspondent in Bosnia in the early 1990s. At the suggestion of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Santiago was appointed as a cultural attaché for UNESCO, and then for the Colombian embassy in New Delhi, India, in the early aughts. Today, he is once more a cultural attaché, being stationed at the Colombian embassy in Beijing, China. In my interview, Santiago spoke about his deep and moving friendship with the Chilean master Roberto Bolaño, the unique proximity to power of intellectuals and writers in Latin America, how the best writers handle politics and fiction. And he also talked about a special lunch he had with the Chinese Nobel Laureate, novelist Mo Yan. Enjoy the conversation. Santiago, certainly you know that in the history of literature, there have been a number of writers who have been exiles from their own country, whether for political reasons or personal reasons. You know, James Joyce comes to mind, Vladimir Nabokov, Henry James, many others. Paul Bowles, who I think is referenced in one of your novels. You spent 30 years outside of Colombia, living in Europe, in India. You're currently in China. My question, I suppose, is, during that entire time, you've continued to write about Bogota, about Colombia. You have Colombian characters. It makes me think, like Joyce, who needed distance from Ireland to really write about Dublin, has that been useful for you to be outside looking in?
Yes, of course. Hello, and thank you, Robert, for your interest in my work. Yes, I think that in my case, you know, every writer has. I always say that every writer should start literature from zero. It's like every writer should invent literature, and every writer has his own way to do. In my case, the literature has been also a way to see deeply my own world, the place where I was birthed, my country, my city, the city where I was a kid, and then when I spent my years of my teen years. So in my case, it was very important to go to another place, and that happens when I was 19. I went to study in Spain, and when I was in Bogota, 17, 18, and 19 years, I was trying also to write, but I didn't have the possibility to see the complete picture. So when I went to Spain, and I started to remember with nostalgia and melancholy, and then I started to understand how was a possibility for me to write about that. So I think is very interesting to see yourself. As I always say, it's like seeing your life or your own house from the house in front of you, from the balcony of the house in front of you, looking at you. And this is literature. I think in a certain way, the literature allows us to see ourselves from the balcony in front. Not only the writers, also the readers, because literature is a complete experience between writing and reading. And we writers, we are writers because we are readers, and because we want to write that book that one day we need in our shelves. So, because that book doesn't exist, we should write it. So for me, it was very important to have this distance. Then I say that because I have other colleagues, writers, that has the opposite experience. They cannot write outside Bogota, outside Colombia or Mexico or whatever. Mexicans are very, very, very in their own place. They like to be there. Colombian, South American writers is more, also because political reasons, dictatorships, and the tradition is different. But in my case, it was very important also to see other cultures, to live in other cities, with other smell, with other sounds, to be alone, far from my protection zone, and feel other things. And I always say, when I started to travel, I was not far away. I was getting closer, more than far away. I was getting closer of that place where for me was like the heart of literature, no? And I always remember Conrad, Joseph Conrad, in Lord Jim, when he said that character, marvelous character, Lord Jim, who was always going into the east, as escaping his guilty, his terrible guilty, and his way to be protected was going to east, no? And because I started from Colombia, my movement was a little bit from east, no? First Europe, because Europe is at the east of Americas, and then now far east. And all that for me has a very deep connection with literature, which is at the end the most important thing for me, and the atmosphere in life where I've been living for the last 50 years.
Yeah, and it makes me think of your description of your journey, makes me understand more about, and I'll ask you a little bit about this later, but in the novel Return to the Dark Valley, you have almost a mini biography of the French poet Rimbaud, and his journey clearly is very, very important to the protagonist in that, and he's a writer, and he's really trying to understand the journey and the search for meaning with Rimbaud. But before I get to that, you mentioned Mexico and the tradition there, and I want to point out that you are currently a cultural attaché to the Colombian embassy in Beijing. And there's an amazing tradition within Latin America of, like, to me, it's astounding. I think the only area that has a similar tradition is probably France. But the caliber of the writers who have served either as, temporary diplomats, cultural attachés, or were in the Foreign Service. I mean, the list is, you know it well: Octavio Paz, Carlos Fuentes, Sergio Pitol, Gabriela Mistral, the Chilean poet, Miguel Angel Asturias from Guatemala. They all, in some capacity, served in the Foreign Service. What is it? You're doing it. What is this tradition?
Well, as you say, the tradition is a very long tradition. Also, one of the most important for me is Pablo Neruda, the
Yes.
big poet and Nobel Prize.
Yes, of
He
course.
has been serving in East when he was very young.
in Burma, I believe. Yeah.
in Burma, and then he has been in India and many other places. And then at the end of his life, he was also the ambassador of Allende, Salvador Allende, in Paris. So yes, well, this is, as you mentioned, this is a French tradition. This proximity between power, politics, and the intellectual. It comes in Latin America as an influence from France, and not only in Latin America, also in Spain. But Spain, in a certain way, Spain as a place where the intellectuals are called by the media, by the newspapers or magazines, to write opinion pages where they talk about politics, and they are weekly or 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, giving their opinions about the life of the society, and that life includes political issues. In Latin America is very, 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 as you mentioned, is very close, that relation between politics and intellectuals. Also because the political power, the government, is very close to the culture in our countries. In your country, in the United States, for instance, it doesn't exist a secretary of culture, no? And this is a big difference. Anglo-Saxons countries, they don't consider that culture is something which is related to the government. It's more an independent, or universities, or the culture is managed by other situations. No? You must think that the Ministry of Culture has been a French invention. The first country which has a Ministry of Culture was France, and the first Minister of Culture in the history of the world was André Malraux, who was he proposed to General de Gaulle after the war in the 60s, end 50s and 60s. He proposed the creation of a Ministry of Culture with the argument that the culture must be also protected and stimulated by the government. And then, because they were after this Second World War, where the culture was also one of the elements in the Nazi, in the Third Reich, the culture was very important. So after that, they said we should also have a political line from the government in the culture. So that was very important, and France was the first country who has that. My country, Colombia, started with that tradition very, very late. It's 1996, I think, the first Ministry of Culture. Before that, we had like some institutions from the government that provide some budget for the culture, but not really a political line. So this is very important to understand first. That's why the culture started to be involved in the politics in a more administrative way. No?
Yeah.
So in the 60s, it starts in France. So the Latin American intellectuals, because the 60s were very, very was a decade very important for the politics. It was the Cuban Revolution, remember, no? In 1959, and then in the 60s, all the intellectuals, all the writers, all the poets, novelists, etc., took place and were engaged in that political issue. So many, for instance, Alejo Carpentier was serving in I think in London, because he was close to the revolutionary government of Fidel Castro. Cabrera Infante served in Belgium, but then he was he was in opposition to the government of Fidel, so he lost his place. And then other intellectuals, Octavio Paz. Well, Mexico has this huge tradition also. Octavio Paz, Carlos Fuentes, and many others. Sergio Pitol, you mentioned it just before. So it's this approachment between the culture and the government, and the idea that the writer is also someone who is listened and respected by the society. So this idea comes close to that French influence.
Yeah.
And that French influence, one of the biggest reference is this end of 19th century writer Émile Zola, which a very important text called J'accuse in French, I accuse,
Yep.
related to a case of a
The Dreyfus
general
affair.
soldier who
Yeah.
was Jewish and
Yes.
who has been punished for something not really important, but because he was Jewish. So in this text, J'accuse de Émile Zola is like the first constitution of this relation between the politics and the intellectuals. And as you may know, in Latin America we are so influenced by that, by this French idea of engagement, much more than the Anglo-Saxon influence. Anglo-Saxon influence came to Latin American writers by different ways, maybe one by one. Every writer was important. Garcia Marquez started to write after reading William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and others. And the big Anglo-Saxon writers has been always very close to the writers, but for literary reasons. But
Yes.
then this complete package of intellectual engagement, someone who is listened by the society, so he assumes a responsibility that probably nobody is asking him, but he
Yeah.
feels that he need
Yeah.
that he must be responsible with this attention that the society gives to him, and give back, giving ideas and participating in the political debate. And from that comes also the idea of serving as cultural
Yeah.
attaché or as ambassador, because the writers has been always seen as a special person, special
Right.
personages, characters. So some governments wanted also to send these political, o sea, these writers as someone who is important for them, and maybe important also for the place where he has been serving. So it's a mixture of that, but but in the center of that is the relation between intellectual and power, who comes from the French influences.
And this makes me think of something I wanted to ask you, which I think fits perfectly into what your answer there, which helps fill in some gaps for me. Is there was a BBC article, and I think it was around the time that there had been the peace process in Colombia, and I think you had returned after 30 years, and I think you were interviewed with some other writers, and you said something. You were quoted in the article, something I wanted to ask you about, and you said, in Anglo-Saxon countries, there is a big gap between politics and fiction. Not here, meaning Colombia, we treasure intellectuals. My form of activism is writing. And before I get your thoughts on that, I want to contrast that with another quote to kind of have us think about is, and you mentioned the Cuban novelist Guillermo Cabrera Infante, excuse me. He had a quote that I find really interesting, and I did a little writing on it. And so I want to contrast that with the quote from the BBC. And he said, any literary work that aspires to the condition of art must forget politics, religion, and ultimately morals. Otherwise, it will be a pamphlet, a sermon, or a morality play. Even the greatest moralist of our century, Joseph Conrad, was first and foremost an entertainer. So I guess the question for me is, how can writers keep their novels, their art, from becoming a kind of advocacy for a particular point of view? And this is something I've always struggled with.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it has been the big issue in literature in the 70s and in the 80s. how to, o sea, the writers were all so engaged politically, but at the same time, it was this freedom of creation. No? So how manage those two positions? So one is the absolute freedom to write whatever you want, and the other one is the responsibility that is not my case today, but in those years, most of the writers felt as a big responsibility to support some ideas, and how it was the balance of those two. I think, again, as usually in art, the relation between politics and literature is present in everything that you do as a writer, and it's not an invention of Latin American writers in the 70s. The relations between politics and literature started in the 5th century before Christ, with the Esquilo and the Persians, for instance. No? Those theater authors were talking about the society, were talking about the politics, were talking about the war, the values, the important issues for the society. So this is a relation that starts very far behind. No, if you take the Aeneid from Virgilium, it was also
good example.
A big political issue behind. No, the Emperor Augustus asked Virgilius to write an epic to justify the conquer of Greece. No, and then we can continue looking in the history, Shakespeare, no, and many others. War and Peace, Tolstoy, of course. Yeah, we are talking about in War of Peace of Tolstoy, that we can read today as a big novel written by a writer 2 years ago. It's amazingly modern. You can see all the movements inside the society where Napoleon was coming, and then the Austro-Hungarian empire was there also, and then the Tsar, and all the intrigues it's amazingly. So how to balance is very difficult to find a definition, because every writer, as I said in my first intervention, every writer is different. So one of the probably easy answer is to say the only difference is the talent of a writer. When a writer is a good writer, even if he has a political idea and he wants to support some ideas on others, if he is a good writer, he will write a masterpiece.
Yeah, and transcend it. Yeah.
Bad writers bad writers, they will always do superficial things.
Yes.
The literature is very cruel. Sometimes it's like people that you don't consider interesting. If you don't consider interesting someone, everything that people say for you would be not interesting. Even the most intelligent things. And then in the other side, the people that you consider interesting, everything they said for you will be interesting, even if there are stupid issues. So good writers and bad writers is a very superficial way to say, but a good writer, when he takes a political issue, becomes a masterpiece. No, so the only difference is that, because in all that you write, there is a political issue, even if you don't. If you never touch, if you only talk about flowers and love and the light of the sun, in the middle of a big revolution, this is also political. Hmm?
Yeah, that is, and I think your point about a master can always transcend and infuse anything and go beyond the obvious or the easy sort of answers. I want to take the chance. You mentioned Alejo Carpentier, who is a Cuban novelist who is, from what I can tell, almost virtually unknown today in North America, which is quite sad. And I think you studied Cuban literature at the university, if I'm not mistaken. I've been on a personal mission to introduce his works to people. I think The Lost Steps, Explosion in the Cathedral are masterpieces. To connect that to politics, he remained, I guess, loyal to the Fidel Castro regime. Towards the end of his life, he served, I think, as the ambassador to France, and I think he ended up dying there. And he had a European background, but he was criticized by a lot of Cuban expatriates for not speaking out when artists in Cuba in the 70s were imprisoned or silenced. I guess my two questions. One, what is the reputation of Carpentier in the Spanish-speaking world today? And if it is not as great as it should be, is it tied up with politics? Or is his work...
No, I don't think so. In Spanish, Latin American countries, even in Spain, Alejo Carpentier is remembered more. For instance, he's very important because he was the first who gave this theory about the magic realism. No?
Right,
in his essays, he spoke for the first time about that. That after, as you know, was the big flag of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez is today is like a saint of the Church of Literature, more than a writer, no? And
Right.
this is another case of a very involved in politics, and all his books are full of political ideas. But we are talking about Alejo Carpentier. Yes, I think maybe Alejo Carpentier is not today an author who is read by the people who just like literature and do other things in life. It's more for specialists, for people who is studying the literature. But
Yeah.
this is a place where many writers are in all the countries. I don't know how many people in US read today. I don't know Lawrence Stern. Maybe
No.
the people who is interested in literature or who is especially studying something or that kind of books. No, Alejo Carpentier is a little bit in that place. He's still a big name. He's a very important author. Is not very well known by the mass of readers, but he is still there, and his influence in my generation, because I cannot talk for new generations, but in my generation, who for us was absolutely important. It's one of the big statues of the literature. I don't know, new generations, I have the idea that they read different than us. No? I asked recently, I was with writers, young writers, 30 years, and I noticed that, for instance, in my generation, if you like one writer, you read the whole opera of that writer.
Yeah.
So I was surprised to find young writers who said, I love that writer. And they were just read one or two books, and I said, oh, okay. So I asked them, who is the writer that you read the whole opera? And they were they quoted all the same, Roberto Bolaño.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Bolaño. Yeah.
Mr. Bolaño is a big writer, probably
Of
the
course.
last big writer, universal writer from Latin America. Yes.
Yeah, and his reputation continues to grow as we speak. I on social media, I certainly see younger graduate students and young writers discovering him again and again and again, which is great news.
I can tell you that I have the big chance to have a lunch some weeks ago with Nobel Prize, Chinese Nobel Prize, Mo Yan.
Oh,
And we were
incredible.
talking,
Incredible, yes.
yeah, and we were talking about literature. And I asked to him, Mr. Mo Yan, today, in your opinion, who deserves the Nobel Prize? And he said,
Yeah.
Roberto Bolaño.
Wow.
Who,
Wow, that's
because
great.
here in China, all the books, it's something like 18 books of Roberto Bolaño are translated and proposed and proposed. And it happens that for a different situation, I was very close to Roberto Bolaño. So I saw that he was he was very, very happy to talk about Bolaño. So I showed him some photos, personal photos with Bolaño, holidays and family, his family and mine, in many years ago, of course, in Italy. And he was completely, oh my God, he was very, very, very touched by that. Yes.
I have to ask, how did you first meet Bolaño? Was it through a conference?
I met Bolaño in '99. We were both invited by a publisher house to write about one city. So they just before the change of century, the Mondadori, I remember it was Mondadori, invited a group of writers, of different writers from Spanish and Latin America, from Spain and Latin America. And then the proposal was very interesting. He said, go to one of these cities, and they had a list of cities, and write about that city.
Yeah.
So I incredibly, I chose Beijing. Because I said it's one city that I want to know, so it is it is the opportunity to do. And Roberto chose Rome, so he came to Rome.
Okay.
So we haven't met, but he wrote me, said, I know that you live in Rome, and I am going to Rome, so can you help me just to have an accommodation? And I was, well, in that moment, Bolaño was not very popular in the readers, but he was very popular between writers. So when I received that email from Roberto, I was shocked. For me, it was like receive an email from Thomas Mann or something like this.
Right.
And I said, of course, Roberto, but come to my place, come to my house. And he said, no, because I should go with my wife, who is pregnant, and my son. So I'm not going to your house, but, and I remember he said, but to the hotel in front of your house. So he came to Rome, and we spent like 15 days. Every day it was so it was marvelous. And then it was like not only he and me, but my wife, his wife Alexandra, and then it was like two families. And then we went to Civitavecchia. We were around. We do a lot of things. We did a lot of things together. And then after that, we have been very, very close friends until his death. I was 10 days, 12 days in Sevilla, just 3 weeks before he dies. It was an amazing surprise for me, because I have been with him for 10, 12 days in Sevilla together. We spent together, and then 3 weeks later he was dying. It was very, very sad. So I met Bolaño in that circumstances.
Amazing that you had both. I mean, for two writers like that to have such a nice connection, that's very beautiful. And
he was old, elder. He was 15 years older than me and my generation, but he always said, "No, my generation is yours, is your generation." So he was, because he started to publish in the 90s, where my generation started to publish, and he said the real age of a writer is when he started to publish. And he wrote a lot of books before being published, no? Because bad luck, and the publisher houses didn't understand his talent until he exploded. No?
Yes. That's a perfect segue into, a question I wanted to ask you is when you look at the English translations of your books, the Europa editions, you'll often see a blurb comparing your work or referencing to Bolaño. And so I thought about it, after reading your work, and I thought, well, there are recurring characters that appear in your fictional universe. A lot of the characters in your novels have a connection to literature, as they do in Bolaño's. And then there was one that really stood out to me. I'm just curious, your thoughts is in Night Prayers, when the Manuel, his monologue, where he recounts his youth and wanting to get close to reading and literature and to be a bohemian. I couldn't help but think of the Savage Detectives and the very first monologue in that. I'm trying to remember the character that it was Juan Garcia Madero of the Visceral Realists. And there was a hypnotic quality to a Bolaño monologue. And I think that's one of your great strengths, is that your first person narrative monologues, there's a real hypnotism that you get pulled along. And I guess you just told us of your personal connection, but professionally, how does that sit with you to think about your work in Bolaño?
Yeah, I think this is a characteristic that comes from literature more, from before. I think also Bolaño gets into a tradition of that kind of situation. A young writer who is trying to make his first weapons in the world of literature.
Yeah.
This is a long tradition there are masterpieces in Anglo-Saxon literature. It's Stephen Dedalus of James Joyce and some others. But in the Latin American world, no, the novel of the young artist, the young artist is James Joyce again, but that novel has been written from a lot of writers. No, the atmosphere of the young people writing poetry, in the case of Bolaño, or starting to write novels and fighting against destiny, world, and trying to open a small place for him as a writer. This is something very I like so much that issue, because it's very, and I like to see how different writers. For instance, in Thomas Mann, we have that also in Dr. Faustus with a musician, but it's how an artist starts from zero and then goes ahead. Somerset Maugham. In all the traditions, we have this image of the writer or the artist from zero to the achievement. Vargas Llosa, for instance, has one of my favorite novels, which is not one of his most popular, is the Aunt Julia and the Script Writer. And if you see that novel, it's exactly that. It's a young Vargas Llosa, speaking, writing in first person of himself, and just telling his own story, how he was trying to become a writer, and it's full of other histories, and it's a marvelous, it's a beautiful.
And of course Proust, right? Proust would be the classic example
Proust
in the French tradition, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, right.
So this is now in Spanish we use in the criticism the word autofiction, but it's like something very popular in the 90s and 21st century. And I said, and Proust, Proust is autofiction way before, no? Yeah. So, but of course, Bolaño is there. Bolaño is in that tradition, but Bolaño was also very influenced by Cortázar No, even if Bolaño in the form is very classic, no, his all these plays with the literature and all these amusing changes of narrative, etc., coming from Cortázar, he was very, very, and he liked it so much, that kind of writers, no, the writers who were a little bit outside. Yeah. Because for Roberto it was very important also the life of the writer. And actually he influenced a lot of young people, not only as writer, but as a way of living, as a way of life, if you want to be that kind of writer. So he was always with an outfit, with his long black coat.
He was like a punk rock figure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, kind of, I don't know, like that kind of singers that has this outfit and this special.
Yes.
Yeah. So Bob Dylan, I don't know. So Roberto was like this, because for him was very important that conjunction. As I told you before, every writer invents literature in his own way, no? And he was very, very strong on that. And then something which is very, very important is how he described these young people and the love of the teenage years for the poetry. And that's beautiful.
It is.
That's for me the point for Bolaño.
Yeah.
And I love Savage Detectives. For me is a masterpiece.
To this day, when I hear Mexico City, I feel a love for Mexico City, and I've never been. You can't criticize Mexico City for me, because it'll always be these young idealistic poets finding their way.
In the Bucareli Avenue. I remember once I was in Mexico City and some friend said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I want to go to Bucareli Avenue because it's named in Savage Detectives, when this strange Uruguayan poet women comes behind the young Mexican poets, and then in Amuleto is the story of Amuleto, and she describes how the young poets were in the Bucareli Avenue in the middle of the night, and the air and the wind of the Bucareli Avenue, and she said in that avenue was like a cemetery, but not a cemetery of 1978, a cemetery of 2066.
Which of course is one of his novels. Yeah.
This is the first mention of the huge masterpiece that he led for when he died.
Yeah, that book still. I need to reread it and reread it again, and I have a Spanish volume as well. Even though my reading in Spanish is poor, I feel like I want to attempt it in Spanish. I want to talk about your work and some of the themes that really jump out to me. One of the themes that kept coming to me was this idea of escape, particularly in Night Prayers and Return to the Dark Valley. I kept feeling that there was this frustration in these characters who wanted to escape a dysfunctional country, a dysfunctional family that is maybe violent or even just Philistines, to escape your gender, to escape prison, prostitution. Again and again, this sort of comes to me. And even I think it's in Night Prayers, the siblings, they mention Papillon, the film with Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman. Why is this theme so resonant for you?
Well, it probably comes from my own life and my way to approach, as I was talking before, the world of literature, or the place, metaphorically, where I think literature that I want to read or to write is, no? Uh, this is probably related of personal experience when I was young, my family, my entourage in Bogota. I always, of course, I was a happy kid when I was young, and I was a very shy teenager, and I was never, I never felt really comfortable. So for me, just to leave Colombia, to leave Bogota, to leave this atmosphere, which was very oppressive for me, it was like a relief. You know? And I started to live different when I, as Virginia Woolf said for women, when I had the keys of a house in my pocket, and I was free, and because no
Yeah.
one knows me, no? And in a certain way, I started my life again when I was in that condition, and then I never, for 30 years, I never came back to Colombia to live. Of course, I came many times back for family visitings and all that, but for 30 years I was living outside. And when I finished the university in Spain, because I had a scholarship, it was difficult for me to how to manage. And then I said, no, I go to Paris and I will do whatever, because also in Paris was Cortázar, and like in my literary church, most of the saints were there, and also some other writers, not from Latin America, but for instance, Henry Miller, who was very important for me also. Paul Bowles, of course,
Yep.
he passed many times from Paris, and Paul Bowles, he was in Tangier and other places, I know,
Yep.
but he was also visiting Paris all the time and writing about Paris. So for me, Paris was the center of, well, the center of the literature. I like it. Paul Auster came later,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
who was a big surprise for the French readers, because he spoke very well French, and
Yeah. He's loved in France. He's very popular
yeah,
there. Yeah. Yeah.
and he started. I read for the first time Paul Auster in French. No, so for me was this idea of being. That's why I probably quoted Lord Jim, this escape from East for East. I, to be honest, I've been never asked about that. So now I'm improvising, but it's true. It's true. Also, it's deeply true what you are saying, and I think it comes from my own
Yeah.
life. As usually in the writers,
Of
we
course.
just we write in the way we live, no?
Yeah.
And important. What is important for the characters of my books, which is important for me, no? It doesn't mean that everything I write is my personal biography,
Right.
but is there, because the personal biography is like the big heritage of a writer to his characters, no? How can I create a character that can be believed by the reader if it's not a human being, and the human
Of
being I
course.
know better, it's me,
Yeah.
myself.
Of course. Of course. Kind of related to that, in Return of the Dark Valley, as I mentioned, you have this, which it surprised me at first, and then I adored it. Is this, I'll call it a mini biography of Rimbaud, that is interspersed with other narratives from other characters, and you start to see a connection between Mrs. Beltran, Manuela Beltran, I believe, and Tertullian, who's a
Yeah,
odd neo-Nazi
yeah,
character, and you call Rimbaud the poet of escape. And there was this passage that really stuck out to me, and I'll quote it. You wrote, "He was the embodiment of the fugitive, obliged to go a long way to fulfill his destiny, to meet it and embrace it, even to interrogate it, to place himself in front of it and look it in the eyes. to go a long way, farther and farther, because any journey deep down is a search for meaning. And so I was thinking to myself, is this search for meaning, is this the reward for escaping, right? Because it's risky to escape. There's a lot of danger. And Rimbaud is a great example of, I mean, the suffering that he went through. But, I'm just curious
Yeah.
if how that strikes you.
Yeah, no, it's very deep and very precise what you are saying. Yeah, this idea of the meaning and the movements. I remember Thoreau that he said the future is in the West, no? And the past is in the East. So every idea who goes to the future is an idea who must follow the sun from east to west, no? But at the same time, my movements were in the opposite side.
Yeah.
I'm improvising now because this is an idea that I never had, but it's very interesting, and it's deeply true that for instance, Rimbaud for me is like one of the center of my love for literature and for poetry.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a certain way, all those writers, Paul Bowles, Henry Miller,
Yeah.
like James Joyce, big fugitives,
Yeah.
that were always looking for some freedom, sometimes for political reasons or for aesthetic reasons, or just because they wanted to look for some different way to live. No, I think I am a different person when I am in China or
Yeah.
in France. I think every language is like a baptism for you because your name sounds different. Here in China, I am something like Santiago.
Mm-hmm.
So in France, I am Monsieur Gamboa, which is different, and in Italy. So every language is in a certain way a new life and a new possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like when a poker table you receive new cards, no?
Yeah.
You can win maybe or
Yeah.
lose. But this
Yeah.
is an interesting.
There's real risk.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think the risk, and that is something that Bolaño pointed in all his books also, the risk is something which is deeply involved with art, no? Because
Yeah.
because art, and for me literature is a form of art, of course, and this is a big risk, you know? So to give your life or to use your time for the creation of art, literature, painting, whatever, is a big risk because you are touching very
Yeah.
dangerous points for yourself, you know, because well, many other people do psychoanalysis or other psychology tests, and literature is also a hospital of psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
How many writers committed suicide?
Yeah.
How many writers were alcoholics, you know, or drug addicts, and they were fighting against big monsters? And where are those
Yeah.
monsters? Inside them. And
Yeah.
the writing or the painting is also a way to escape of those monsters and this fire who is burning them. No? So yes, I this is the kind of writer I am also. No?
Yeah, and one of the things again for folks who haven't read your novels and who hopefully will soon after hearing this and be more interested is, you aren't afraid to go after, areas that are unsettling. I mean, one of the things that I think about reading is many of your characters, at least in the novels I was looking at, they're in some ways transformed by violence. Not meaning it's positive, it's negatives, but they become new people often because of sexual violence, and they're deeply changed by it. But it almost seems like Rimbaud is an example where, he went from a, kind of a frivolous, not frivolous, but maybe a child poet to a different person after, being assaulted in a military barracks. It kind of makes me think about, is there a Christian dimension to some of this where, the violence of the crucifixion leads to redemption? And I'm not saying that you do anything easy or obvious in that way, but where is Christianity lurking somewhere in the soul of Santiago Gamboa? I know one of your novels.
This is a very
Yeah,
good question because
yeah,
I am not I'm not religious. I'm not a believer,
yeah,
but I belong to the Christian culture.
yeah,
Many times I've been asked if I believe in God, and I said
yeah,
yes. I believe. For me, God exists in the same way exists Colonel Aureliano Buendía of 100 Years of Solitude. Is a creation, no? Is a human creation, and the religion for me is probably the most huge masterpiece of human experience, because the religion use the art to give reality to something which is not in the nature. You cannot see the religion if you go around in the nature. So how can we make visible?
yeah,
And the religion is a mixture of literature, poetry, architecture,
yeah,
painting, opera, and also philosophy, history. So it's really the big synthesis of the culture. So I, of course, belong to that culture, and I've been from. I'm not from a religious family. My parents are professors in the public university in Bogota. They were people from different experiences. Of course, the rest of my life, of my family, is very religious, but it was not my education. And I think for having a very deep spirituality in the religion, you should be educated like this, or maybe along your life to have maybe a big tragedy or something like this, and then you become. I can understand very well that I'm not a believer, but I belong to that culture, and I know
yeah,
very well, and I like so much the writers, Dostoevsky, the Christian
yeah,
writers. I like
yeah.
Dostoevsky, Francois Mauriac, Graham Greene. Graham Greene is one of my biggest.
I
I think it's
love him.
I think
Love him.
is the writer. If you, I hope one day you come to my library, to my personal, you will notice that I have something like 67 books of Graham Greene,
Wow.
two first editions. So it's really an author I really love. I read a lot, and many times, most of his books. I love The Quiet American. I've been in Saigon, which today is Ho Chi Minh City, to the Continental Hotel just to go there
Me
to
too.
see the Quiet American. I
Yeah,
love so much the end of the affair, and the first two paragraphs of that novel is for me really the masterpiece of how to begin a novel.
yeah, yeah.
And
Oh,
also
I
his way, the way he treat the guilty situations and all these questions that is very religious. In my novel Night Priors, in a certain way, it's like a religious thread, because
yeah,
those young brother and sister, which are completely alone not only in the world, it's like in the universe, and
yeah,
nobody hear their prayers. It's in a certain way is a religious experience,
yeah,
because it's
yeah.
also
I
the absence of God is also a religious experience, and it's also a
Yeah.
religious question, as Dostoevsky used to say, if God doesn't exist, it means that everything is possible, no?
Yeah.
So also a world without God is a religious idea. No?
No, it's a great point. And yeah, I mean, those British writers who were converted to Catholicism, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, Muriel Spark, Catholicism really, I think, helped give them a framework to write these great books.
Yeah, and in the Bible there are amazing dialogues. For instance, when in St. John, he said, when you didn't saw me, I was so close of you. Well, I don't I cannot quote it in English. In Spanish is, cuando nunca me veías era cuando más cerca estaba de ti. When you never saw me was the moment where I was more closer.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Something like
yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. That the real presence of God. Yeah, that invisible presence. Um, this is beautiful stuff, and it makes me want to point out that The Night Will Be Long, which was published in English or translated in English in 2019, does deal with kind of a Catholic or the rise of evangelical churches in Colombia, but in the context of this wonderful sort of detective
Yeah.
story with these two wonderful women. And this is a lovely book. I always hesitate to ask a writer, when is the next book coming, or but I suppose I do have to ask a little bit. Is there a project in the
Well,
work that you're excited
after
about?
no, after the the night will be long. I have other books
Yep.
that are not still translated in English.
Yeah.
There is a like a sequel, but it's not exactly a sequel. But it's with the same characters. It's called Colombian Psycho. No?
Yes. Yes.
Colombian Psycho, and
Yes.
this was my last novel. It's like 6 years ago, and now I
Yes.
am preparing I'm finishing a long novel, like 600 pages, with many subjects, and I am hesitating the title, which is one of my headaches, because I have 10 different titles. But yes, I still I want to close the set of novels with those
Yeah.
two characters, women, the
Yeah.
journalist and her.
Oh, okay.
That starts in the night will be long, Colombian
Yes.
Psycho, and then this third, and then
Okay.
it's over, no. But I hope they will be well, as you know and notice. I am not I am a writer in US that has a small, let's say, I have a small success. No, it's not a big success. I have a small success, so my books are not translated immediately as other writers. But I hope.
We will work on changing that.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So yes,
And then
yes. Well, my life is since I was 14 years old. I started to read obsessively at 7 or 8, and at when I was 14 years, I said I would never spend a whole day in my life outside this world of literature.
Yeah.
And now I am 60, and I can, if I have in front of me that child of 14 years, he will say, "Good." And I will
That's a good life.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's your destiny. It's your life. Before we close up, I'd love to know if there's any books on your bookshelf that you're reading right now that you can't put down, that you love, that you're excited about.
Yeah.
Do you read primarily in Spanish, or at this point is it both Spanish and French that you're reading in?
Well, I read in many languages. I read in Spanish, I read in English, I read in French, and I read in Italian.
That's
But
beautiful.
sometimes I read in translations also, because I believe so much in translations. I think the literature has no boundaries. Garcia Marquez said that he discovered that he was a writer reading Faulkner and Kafka. And how he read Faulkner and Kafka? In German? No, translated to Spanish. Faulkner
Yeah.
in English? No, translated to Spanish. And if you
Yeah.
go to Kafka, Kafka loved most of all Dostoevsky. And how Kafka read Dostoevsky? In Russian? No, he read in German, translated.
Yes.
And if you go to Dostoevsky, Dostoevsky was Agni in front of Balzac. And how he read Balzac? In French? No, he read in Russian. And all read the Bible. Each one in his. So I believe so much in translations.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
like so much when the translator is a good writer, and there is also a big tradition of writers translators. Borges, Jorge Luis Borges translated, for
Yes.
instance, Virginia Woolf. Julio Cortázar
Yes.
translated Marguerite Yourcenar. Many writers, even in my generation, young people, for instance, Juan Gabriel Vázquez translated Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness. No, so there is a long tradition of writers translating literature, and I love that. So
Yeah.
now I'm reading in Spanish. Of course, there is a writer that I follow so much, and I love so much. Is my generation. He's from Norway. He's called Knausgaard. Knausgaard.
Oh, I know him. Yeah. I love him.
And I
My struggle.
I
Yeah.
sometimes I noticed in his books that I have something in common with him, and it's something very. It's the way of we should tell everything. We cannot, if a character is arriving to a house to see someone, maybe other writers make point and then immediately start the conversation with the person that character is going to see. But I need, for my way to write, I need to arrive with the character to the door, to open the door, to get to the
Interesting.
lift. And I noticed that he has the same problem. So I really like to read how Knausgaard deals with that. And I have maybe all his books, because
Yeah.
I like to check. This is writer's secrets, no? To check how he do this and how he manage this and how he, for instance, when a conversation becomes very tough and very deep, suddenly you need a break. How he do that? And so maybe a bird passed through,
Yeah.
and he describes the bird, and he said it was very hot summer and the wind was hot still, and then he continued the conversation. That kind of small details I like so much how he managed. So
You know, it's
I read very very deeply Mr. Knausgaard.
it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was reading The Night Will Be Long, and there's a scene where I believe it was the journalist protagonist, and she goes into a cafe, and she's stressed, and she's trying not to drink, and so she doesn't want to get a gin and tonic. She enters the cafe, and she says to the waiter, I think she says something like, I'll have a green tea with 2 tea bags. And he says, we don't have green tea with 2 tea bags. She goes, give me Earl Grey. And he says, we don't. And then eventually she uses this as an excuse to order a gin and tonic. But as I read it, I was thinking, knowing I'm in the hands of a good writer and nothing is overlooked, I was wondering why you were giving me that level of detail. But it was also a way where she was trying not to get that drink. And when I stepped back from the scene, I said, okay, so this is why, because I was thinking, why did he just cut to a conversation or the drink? But I could see now what you're doing. And Nosgard is amazing because he goes to IKEA with his daughter, and they enter the elevator, and just as you're saying, and if you trust the writer, you can go with them, and you can find riches with that trust. Yeah.
I appreciate that you mentioned that scene of the gin. Actually, I have some.
I noticed your characters like gin and tonics. Yeah, I'm a big fan too.
This one is from Cambodia, gin.
Okay.
This one is from Japan, and this one is from Colombia, and different gins.
Oh,
it's not
very nice.
Tonic because here is 8 in the morning, but.
Well, wait until noon.
Exactly. Yes, of course.
I have to say this has been just an absolute pleasure. Please, you have an open invitation to come back anytime. And I encourage anyone listening to this to please seek out Santiago's novels, read them deeply, and enjoy them, and think about them and sit with them. So thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure.
No, thank you, Robert, for having me and your interest for my work. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. To keep up with my interviews, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can also go to Substack and sign up for a free literature and geopolitics newsletter. Every week you'll get articles by me on literary taste, current affairs, and history's curious turns. Thanks again for watching.